I think I think it's time to return back home.
Oh my God!
Mido did not dump Debby. And somehow, what actually happened might be even more concerning. Because when Mido looked at Debby inside that wedding chapel and told her he thought it was time to go back home to Egypt, Debby believed him. She didn't think he was joking. She didn't think this was some cute setup. She genuinely believed that after 6 years of building this relationship, after bringing him to America, after all the arguments, all the doubts, all the conversations about marriage, Mido had finally decided he was done. And he let her believe it. Debby walked outside, completely crushed. She was crying. She looked like somebody whose biggest fear had just been confirmed in the worst possible way. And then Mido came outside with a ring. So no, the real story here isn't that Mido dumped Debby. The real story is that Mido apparently decided the best way to propose to a woman who has spent most of this season questioning whether he actually wants her was to first convince her that he absolutely did not. And that is where this gets interesting. Because people can debate whether this was just Mido's strange sense of humor. People can say Debby surprised him with a wedding chapel, so he wanted to surprise her right back. And maybe, in Mido's head, this was supposed to be dramatic and unforgettable. Well, he definitely got the unforgettable part right. But romantic? That's where I have questions. Because this wasn't a prank happening inside some rock-solid relationship where both people feel completely secure. This happened after fights, after accusations, after family warnings, after arguments about Hollywood, after Debby admitted that she had basically stopped having serious conversations with Mido because avoiding those conversations was keeping the peace. So, was this just a terrible proposal idea? Or did this moment accidentally expose the entire way Debby and Mido's relationship works? Because the more I look at these two, the more I think that chapel scene was not some weird exception. It was their entire relationship compressed into a few minutes. Debby gets scared. Debby pushes for reassurance. Mido feels pressured. Mido pulls away. Debby panics even more. Then Mido comes back with some dramatic gesture that makes everything feel okay again. Until the next problem. And that cycle may be a much bigger issue than whether Mido wants Hollywood. Let's start with what actually happened, because the setup matters. By this point, Debby is tired of waiting. The clock is moving. Mido's time in America isn't unlimited. They're supposedly here to figure out whether they're getting married, but somehow they're getting closer and closer to the deadline while Mido still seems more excited talking about acting than talking about a wedding. And Debby knows that. This is what makes her behavior so interesting. She isn't completely unaware of the problem. She literally notices that when the conversation turns to their relationship, Mido can become quiet, vague, uncomfortable, or emotionally checked out. But bring up acting? Suddenly there's energy. Suddenly there's enthusiasm. Suddenly Mido has plenty to say. And I think that difference bothers Debby more than she wants to admit. Because if you're constantly asking your partner, do you want to be here? Do you want this relationship? Do you actually want to marry me? While watching that same person light up the second somebody says the word Hollywood, of course you're going to wonder where you rank on the priority list. That doesn't prove Mido is using her. And I think that's an important distinction. We can question his priorities without pretending we can read his mind. Maybe Mido genuinely loves Debby and genuinely wants an acting career. Both things can be true. Maybe coming to America gave him two huge goals at the same time. Build a life with Debby and try to create the career he has always imagined for himself. But the problem is that Debby doesn't seem convinced those goals are equal. And honestly, watching them, I understand why. Mido talks about acting like somebody discussing his purpose in life. Marriage often sounds like something he needs more time to think about. That difference creates insecurity. And insecurity is where Debby's pattern starts. When Debby feels unsure, she doesn't back away. She moves closer. She asks more questions. She asks for reassurance. She wants him to say the right thing. She wants him to tell her that he's here for them. She wants him to prove she is the priority. And when she doesn't get enough reassurance verbally, she starts trying to create certainty through action. That's where the wedding chapel comes in. Debby basically decides, enough waiting. I'm going to move this thing forward. And from her perspective, I understand the frustration. You've been together for years. This man traveled to America on a relationship path that is supposed to end with a decision about marriage. The clock is ticking. At some point, I need more time stops feeling like thoughtfulness and starts feeling like avoidance. So Debby takes Mido to this chapel. And Mido does not look thrilled. Actually, he looks like somebody who just realized the casual conversation has suddenly turned into a final exam. Debby is talking about getting married in a few weeks, and Mido immediately starts talking about pressure. Now, this is where I can give Mido some sympathy. Being surprised with a wedding venue is a lot. Even if you entered America planning to marry someone, you still want to feel included in the actual wedding decision. You want to discuss the date. You want to discuss the venue. You want to feel like you're making the choice together. So when Mido says he doesn't like being pushed, that part by itself is not outrageous. The problem is everything that happens next. Because instead of saying, Debby, I do want to marry you, but I don't like being brought here without talking about it first, Mido goes nuclear. He tells her he thinks it's time to return home. And that sentence hits Debby exactly where she is most vulnerable. Think about what Debby has been worried about all season. Is Mido really here for me? Does he want this marriage? Does he care more about acting? Is he going to leave? So when he says he's going back to Egypt, Debby doesn't hear a random comment. She hears every fear she's had for months suddenly becoming reality. That's why she breaks down. And this is also why the proposal reveal bothers so many viewers. Because Mido knew this relationship had insecurity around commitment. He knew Debby needed reassurance. He knew she worried that he wasn't fully invested. And instead of starting his proposal by giving her security, he started by taking all of it away. Then, once she was devastated, he reversed the emotion. Suddenly, it's not a breakup. Suddenly, there's a ring. Suddenly, the worst day is supposed to become one of the best days. That emotional swing is enormous. And here's the uncomfortable question. Does the relief make the proposal feel more powerful? Because Debby goes from thinking she has lost everything to discovering that she is actually getting the commitment she has been begging for. That's emotional whiplash. And I'm not saying Mido sat down and developed some complicated psychological strategy. We don't know that. Maybe he honestly thought it would be funny. Maybe he thought, she surprised me with the chapel, so I'm going to surprise her with the proposal. Maybe this was his version of dramatic romance. But intention and impact are not the same thing. You can intend something to be funny and still hurt someone. You can intend something to be romantic and still create a horrible experience. And for me, that's the bigger point. A memorable proposal is not automatically a healthy proposal. If the setup requires your partner to genuinely believe you've abandoned them, maybe the surprise has gone a little too far. And this brings us to the biggest issue between Debby and Mido. I don't actually think Hollywood is their biggest problem. Hollywood is the loudest problem. Their biggest problem is how they handle conflict. Debby said something this season that I think people should pay much more attention to. After one of their major fights, she explained that things were getting better because she was trying not to have heavy conversations. Think about that. The relationship improved because they stopped talking about the issues causing the relationship problems. That's not resolution. That's a ceasefire. And there is a massive difference. If you and your partner fight every time you discuss money, and you decide to stop discussing money, you haven't solved the money problem. You've just created a quieter house. Eventually, the bill still arrives. That's basically Debby and Mido. They stop having difficult conversations, so the relationship feels peaceful. Debby sees the absence of fighting and thinks, okay, we're doing better. But underneath that calm, she still doesn't know if he's committed. She still doesn't know what happens with Hollywood. She still doesn't know whether marriage is actually happening. She still doesn't know what their future looks like. So all that anxiety keeps building until she finally does something dramatic.
Surprise wedding chapel.
And look at the pattern. Debby becomes anxious. She pursues Mido. Mido feels pressure. He withdraws. Debby gets even more anxious. She pursues harder. Mido withdraws harder. Then something dramatic happens. They eventually reconnect. Everybody calms down. And then the real issue is still there. Relationship experts sometimes describe versions of this as a pursuer-withdrawer dynamic. One person feels distance and responds by chasing more connection. The other person experiences that pursuit as pressure and responds by creating more distance. The first person sees that distance and becomes even more anxious. So they push harder. And now both people are accidentally creating the exact behavior they hate in the other person. That is Debby and Mido all over. Debby wants reassurance, but her pressure can make Mido pull away. Mido wants space, but his withdrawal makes Debby feel like she needs even more reassurance. Neither one gets what they want. And the chapel scene is basically that cycle turned up to 100. Debby says, we need to move forward. Mido says, you're pressuring me. Debby tries to understand what's wrong. Mido basically says, maybe I should leave. Debby collapses emotionally. Then Mido comes back with the ring. Crisis. Relief. Reset. But was anything actually solved? That's my question. Because yes, they're engaged after that moment. But engagement does not automatically fix communication. Marriage doesn't fix it either. A wedding certificate can confirm commitment legally. It cannot create emotional security by itself. And that's why I'm also interested in the Hollywood issue. Again, I don't think it's fair to say Mido is definitely using Debby. We don't have proof of that. But I absolutely understand why Debby worries about his priorities. This man seems incredibly ambitious. He wants to act. He wants opportunities. He wants to succeed. He talks about Hollywood like he can already see his name on a movie poster. And ambition is not a bad thing. Actually, there's something almost admirable about somebody arriving in a new country and still believing they can build a huge career. But marriage forces ambition to become practical. It's easy to say, I want Hollywood. Okay, where are you living? Who is paying for acting classes? What happens while you're trying to find work? How long are you willing to pursue acting before finding another source of income? Does Debby want to move? Can Debby move? What happens if she doesn't want to leave New Orleans? What if the acting career takes 5 years? What if it never happens? Those aren't attacks on Mido. Those are normal adult questions. And that's why Debby's son Caden becomes important. Because family skepticism is always easy to dismiss when it sounds like, I just don't trust this guy. But once the family starts asking practical questions about finances, careers, and stability, Mido has to provide practical answers. Love does not pay rent. A dream does not automatically become a plan. And if Mido wants everybody to take his acting goals seriously, he needs to show them that he's thinking beyond the dream. What is Plan B? What is Plan C? How does he financially contribute while pursuing Plan A? Because this relationship already has a power imbalance. Debby is more established in America. Mido is rebuilding. That can create dependency. But emotionally, the imbalance sometimes runs in the opposite direction. Debby appears much more afraid of losing Mido than Mido appears afraid of losing Debby. And that matters. Financially, Debby may have more stability. Emotionally, Mido may have more leverage. Because the person who is more willing to walk away often controls the temperature of the relationship. Again, I'm not saying Mido is deliberately calculating that. I'm talking about the dynamic we can observe. Debby repeatedly asks him to confirm the relationship. Mido repeatedly seems uncomfortable when the conversation gets serious. That means Debby is constantly waiting for reassurance from the person who seems least interested in giving it. And that brings us right back to the proposal. Because what did Debby finally get? Maximum reassurance. A ring. A proposal. A public symbol that says, yes, I'm choosing you. But she had to experience maximum insecurity immediately before receiving it. That is why this scene is such a perfect metaphor for their entire relationship. Now, online, viewers are divided on who deserves more criticism. A lot of fans feel Mido's fake breakup was cruel. Some viewers are calling it emotionally manipulative because he appeared to know exactly how seriously Debby was taking the breakup while continuing the setup. There were also viewers watching Mido's facial expressions and saying they thought he looked amused or like he was smirking while Debby was upset. But that's where we need to be careful. That's interpretation. We can't say a facial expression proves he enjoyed hurting her. We can say some viewers interpreted it that way. And honestly, the fact that so many people had that reaction tells you something about public perception of Mido already. Viewers don't give him much benefit of the doubt. And that's not because of one proposal. It's because of the pattern that came before it. Then you have another section of the audience that is almost more frustrated with Debby. They're basically saying, how many warnings does she need? Her friends have had concerns. Her family has had concerns. Debby herself has concerns. She sees how excited Mido gets about acting. She knows how difficult their communication can be. She knows they've had ugly arguments. And still, she continues moving forward. I understand that frustration. But I also think reducing Debby to she's stupid for staying is too easy. People stay in complicated relationships for complicated reasons. She has 6 years invested in this. That's history. That's emotional investment. That's a picture of the future she has probably been carrying in her head for years. So every time things improve, even temporarily, Debby may see that improvement as proof that the relationship she hoped for is still possible. That's why I think her avoidance of heavy conversations is so revealing. She doesn't seem to be avoiding them because she doesn't know they're important. She avoids them because she's afraid of what happens when they talk honestly. And that is a much sadder situation. If the only way your relationship feels peaceful is when you stop asking important questions, the peace itself becomes fragile. Then there's a third group of viewers who think both Debby and Mido are dramatic. And honestly, I think there's something to that interpretation. Look at what both of them do. Debby feels uncertain about marriage, so instead of calmly sitting down and forcing a final decision, she surprises him with a chapel. Mido feels surprised by the chapel, so instead of calmly telling her how he feels, he stages an apparent breakup before proposing. They're both turning uncomfortable conversations into big, dramatic moments. And on reality television, that's entertaining. In an actual marriage, that's exhausting. Not every disagreement can become a test. Not every insecurity can become a surprise. Not every conflict can end with somebody crying and then suddenly receiving some grand romantic gesture. Eventually, marriage becomes boring things. Bills, schedules, jobs, family obligations, where you're going to live, who's cooking dinner, who's paying for what happens when acting auditions don't work out, what happens when Debby doesn't want to move, what happens when Mido feels controlled, what happens when Debby feels ignored. That's where we find out whether the relationship actually works. And I think Mido's line about not being able to find himself in New Orleans deserves more thought too. Some people immediately interpreted that as manipulation. Like maybe Mido was trying to push Debby toward relocating closer to Hollywood. Possible. But there's another interpretation. Imagine leaving Egypt, coming to Louisiana, depending heavily on your partner, speaking a language you're still improving, and suddenly feeling like the identity you had back home doesn't fully exist anymore. Mido sees himself as an actor. He wants status. He wants success. He wants to feel like he's moving toward something. So maybe Hollywood isn't only about fame. Maybe it's also about autonomy. Maybe Mido wants to prove that he can create his own identity in America instead of simply becoming Debby's husband. That doesn't erase the relationship problems, but it does make him more complicated than a cartoon villain. And I think good commentary has to allow that possibility. Mido can love Debby and still be selfish. He can love Debby and still prioritize acting too much. He can genuinely feel lost and still communicate that feeling badly. He can genuinely want marriage and still hate feeling pressured.
Two things can be true at the same time.
The same applies to Debby. Debby can genuinely love Mido and still pressure him. She can have valid concerns and still handle those concerns badly. She can be right about his priorities and still avoid conversations until the anxiety explodes. Nobody here has to be 100% villain or 100% victim for the relationship to have serious problems. And that's what I think people miss when they only ask, is Mido using Debby? Maybe. Maybe not. But we don't even need that question to identify the red flags. Here's what we can actually see. They avoid serious conversations because those conversations create conflict. Debby repeatedly needs reassurance. Mido repeatedly seems uncomfortable providing it. Major arguments can end without the underlying issue being clearly resolved. Their priorities around marriage and career do not always appear aligned. The proposal used threatened abandonment as part of the surprise. And we still don't have a clearly demonstrated long-term plan for location, career, and finances.